The sky bled. It wasn't sunset, but the harbinger of an incandescent nightmare. The air, thick and metallic, whispered ancient secrets, warnings of a geological fury about to explode. A guttural roar tore through the primordial quiet, emanating from the earth's depths, a primal scream that would awaken the deepest fear in every creature. Darkness swallowed the daylight, as ash, fine as the dust of death, began to fall, blanketing the landscape in a gray shroud. There was nowhere to run. The earth was opening up, and its children, the first humans, were about to face hell. The morning sun rarely penetrated the dense canopy of the ancient forest, a vibrant tangle of life and danger that stretched for countless miles. The scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the musk of wild animals filled the air, an olfactory symphony of an untouched world. The sounds of the forest were a familiar tapestry. The sharp chirping of exotic birds, the discreet rustling of creatures scurrying through the foliage, the incessant hum of insects. But on that day, there was a subtle dissonance, a latent nervousness that manifested in the unusual silence of certain species and the apprehensive gaze of others. In the heart of this primeval vastness, a female Homo habilis named Lyra scoured the forest floor in search of edible roots, her offspring in tow. Lyra, with her curious eyes and unusual dexterity in manipulating rudimentary stone tools, felt the irregular pulse of the earth beneath her feet. Small tremors, almost imperceptible, came and went, like the irregular heartbeats of a sleeping giant. The clearing where they stood was a temporary oasis, bathed in sunbeams that stubbornly found a way through the dense foliage. Her agile fingers turned over the earth, exposing nutritious tubers. The little one, still dependent on her warmth and protection, watched, imitated, learned. Lyra taught him the names of edible plants, the sounds that indicated the presence of game, and the dangers to avoid. Routine was their anchor in a world of uncertainties, a dance of survival repeated with each dawn. They were not alone. Other members of their band were scattered throughout the forest, conducting their own searches, relying on each other for protection. There was an elder of the band, named Kale, whose deep wrinkles told stories of many seasons and overcome dangers. He had an almost mystical connection with the earth, able to predict changes in weather and the movements of animals. But on that day, Kale was restless, his small, keen eyes scanning the horizon with growing concern. Suddenly, a stronger tremor shook the earth, causing Lyra to lose her balance. A sharp cry from a bird in the trees, an alarm chorus that quickly spread through the forest, echoed through the valleys. The ground trembled with more intensity, and a distant rumble, like muffled thunder, echoed from the depths of the forest, not from the sky, but from somewhere underground, a hollow, deep sound that seemed to emerge from the world's very core. The air grew heavy, and Lyra felt an unusual heat on her skin, like the heat of an invisible fire. It was not the sun. It was something more primitive, more threatening. Lyra's child, sensing the abrupt change in the environment, began to whimper, snuggling against his mother's leg, eyes wide with fear. A sulphurous, acrid, and unknown smell began to spread, mixing with the natural scents of the forest, slowly suffocating them like the putrid breath of a monster. Lyra raised her head, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where a dark, dense cloud began to rise, swelling in the sky like a grotesque wound. It was not a rain cloud, she knew. A chilling premonition, older than any memory, gripped her chest. The world she knew, the forest that protected and fed her, was about to transform into something unrecognizable. Kale, the elder, emerged from the dense vegetation, his face pale and his eyes filled with a terror Lyra had never seen in him before. He pointed to the dark cloud, his words a desperate plea. The mountain. "It's alive." The sound of a branch snapping in the distance, accompanied by a low growl, made her turn sharply, stone tool in hand. A large feline, its eyes gleaming in the gloom, watched them. But instead of attacking, the predator seemed uneasy, its muscles tense, its senses sharpened. It too felt the imminent change, and its gaze was not that of a hunter, but of a creature sensing a greater danger. Suddenly, the feline let out a shriek of terror and vanished into the forest in a desperate run, ignoring the easy prey. Lyra knew it wasn't her presence that had scared off the beast, but something much, much worse. Something was coming. Something that terrified even the most formidable predators. What could it be? The ground began to shake harder, and the mountain's roar intensified, announcing the arrival of a catastrophe that would change the face of the world forever. The forest, once a sanctuary, now became a trap. The initial rumble transformed into a continuous thunder, a deafening roar that vibrated in Lyra's very skeleton, resonating in her bones and soul. The dark cloud on the horizon, once a distant smudge, now dominated the sky, swallowing the daylight and painting the world in shades of gray and a ghostly orange-red, like an open wound in the celestial vault. The smell of sulfur became suffocating, burning her nostrils and throat, and Lyra felt her lungs ache with each breath, each inhale an agony. Fine ash droplets, like a macabre snow, began to fall, covering leaves, branches, the forest floor, transforming the vibrant green into a monochromatic shroud of dust, silently devouring the world's color. Pure, primal terror seized Lyra, but she could not afford to succumb to it. Her child, pressed against her body, coughed and whimpered incessantly, his eyes wide, reflecting the horror of the sky, a small mirror of universal despair. Lyra knew she had to move and fast. The wind's direction was crucial. The cloud of ash and suffocating haze was spreading with alarming speed, engulfing everything in its path. She remembered an old trail that led to a series of caves on the higher slopes of the mountains, far from the volcanic ravine that now vomited smoke and ash with unimaginable violence. The path was treacherous, covered with loose rocks and thick vegetation. A natural labyrinth, but it was their only chance. Lyra firmly grasped her child's hand, forcing him to run, ignoring his protests and small falls, the tears wetting his face. The ground trembled incessantly, causing towering trees to sway like reeds, their trunks creaking in protest, and some, already weakened by age and tremors, fell with a crash, crushing vegetation and soil in a whirlwind of broken branches and earth. The cries of animals, once a distant chorus of panic, were now a deafening lament. As the forest transformed into a chaos of flight and despair, a blind race for life. Herds of herbivores, driven by terror, ran blindly, trampling everything in their path, their eyes wide and devoid of reason. Lyra had to be faster, more cunning, avoid being crushed by the stampeding mass of animals, a wave of desperate life. As they ran, a colossal explosion shook the air. A sound so powerful it seemed to tear the very fabric of reality, a rupture in the space-time continuum. A colossal column of smoke and ash, tinged with reddish lightning, shot towards the sky like a furious fist from hell, striking the clouds and transforming them into an extension of its own fury. The heat was unbearable, even at this distance, and Lyra could feel the air vibrate with the raw energy of the eruption, her ears ringing with the sound's intensity. Droplets of molten rock, small and bright like shooting stars, began to fall, incinerating everything they touched with a sinister hiss. A forest of flames began to rise behind them, trees exploding into infernos with a dry, sinister crackle, their leaves turning to ash in seconds. Lyra felt the hot breath of the fire on her back, the threat drawing ever closer. Faster, she whispered to herself, feeling the air thin and panic swelling within her like a tide. Her muscles ached, her lungs burned, but the image of her child beside her propelled her forward, an unshakable force within her being. She saw others of her kind, slender and terrified figures, also running, some dragging their injured, others leaving behind those who fell, in a brutal choice for survival. It was an individualistic flight, each for themselves, in a world that was disintegrating, where the only law was that of survival. With each step, she looked back at the monstrous volcanic cloud that seemed to pursue them, engulfing the landscape, consuming everything in its path. She wondered if fate would catch them before they reached safety. And if they reached the caves, would they truly be safe from the earth's fury? What awaited them there? The ground trembled again, stronger than ever, and a new wave of ash and incandescent debris hit them, momentarily blinding them. The race for life was becoming a race against time, and time was running out. The trail Lyra and their child followed became increasingly steep and treacherous, an exhausting climb through a landscape rapidly transforming into a purgatory of ash and rocks. The sun was now a distant memory, replaced by an oppressive darkness as dense as the deepest night, but tinged with a reddish, sickly glow emanating from the furious mountain, like an infernal eye watching them. Ash fell ceaselessly, a constant rain of volcanic dust that suffocated everything, covering skin, hair, eyes, and each breath was a painful effort, filling their lungs with the metallic, abrasive taste of death. The sounds of the forest had ceased, replaced only by the sharp hiss of the ash-laden wind and the guttural roar of the mountain, which now seemed like an incessant drum beating the funeral rites of a dying world. Lyra, with burning eyes and a parched throat, pushed forward with stubborn determination. A flame of resilience lit within her. Her feet bled with each step over sharp rocks and debris, and her muscles protested with exhaustion. But the flame of hope, however faint, propelled her, a tenuous promise of a future. Her child, coughing and gasping, stumbled every few steps, the weight of terror and exhaustion making his limbs heavy, his small arms clinging desperately to his mother. Lyra, several times, carried him in her arms, feeling his small, feverish, trembling body against hers, his warmth a small island of comfort in the cold of despair. The volcanic rock, which formed the trail's bed, was warm to the touch, and in some spots, small fissures expelled sulfurous vapors, like the breath of a sleeping dragon. The smell was almost unbearable, and Lyra had to cover her nose and mouth with her forearm, trying to filter the toxic air, seeking minimal relief. They were not alone. Other groups of Homo habilis, remnants of different bands, dragged themselves along the same trail, gray ghosts in the volcanic darkness. Faces marked by despair, eyes lost and empty, bodies bent by exhaustion and hunger. Some fell and did not rise, their bodies soon swallowed by the thick layer of ash, becoming part of the inanimate landscape, a macabre fusion with the earth itself. No one stopped. There was no time for grief, for compassion. Only the urgency of survival, a brutal and selfish urgency. Lyra witnessed a scene that haunted her for many days of darkness. A strong male, with a baby in his arms, stumbled over a loose rock. The baby slipped and rolled down a small ravine, disappearing into the darkness and the veil of ash. The male's cry, a howl of agony and despair, was quickly muffled by the mountain's roar, a somber melody of losses. He did not hesitate, did not search for his child. Life demanded the sacrifice of the weak for the survival of the strong. It was the law of nature, relentless and cruel, amplified in its brutality by the imminent catastrophe, which stripped bare the wildest essence of existence. As they approached the caves, the trail narrowed, flanked by sharp rocks and deep abysses where the darkness seemed even denser. The wind, once a mere whisper, now lashed, carrying with it pebbles and incandescent debris that mixed with the ash, small fiery projectiles in the cold air. Lyra had to crouch, shielding her child under her body, while small hot projectiles whizzed past them, threatening to burn them alive. The cave entrance looked like an open mouth in the mountain, a promise of refuge, but also of an unknown darkness, a plunge into the earth's belly. When they finally reached the opening, Lyra felt a momentary relief, A pause in the nightmare, a brief respite. But looking back, she saw the mountain in its fullest fury, spewing a river of incandescent lava that flowed down the slopes like a fire serpent, devouring everything in its path. The forest, once a sanctuary, was now a sea of flames, the air filled with the crackling of wood and the sweet, nauseating smell of burning flesh. They had escaped the immediate eruption, but the danger was far from over. Would the caves, however promising as shelter, truly be safe? Or would what awaited them inside be as terrible as what they left behind? A new kind of terror began to settle, the terror of waiting, of uncertainty, of what the world had become and what it could still do. The cave entrance was a dark, damp hole in the mountainside, a faint promise of refuge from the hell unfolding outside. The air inside the cave was colder, denser, and damper, saturated with the smell of wet rock and a slight, yet unmistakable, odor of earth and animal life, mixed with the persistent smell of smoke and ash that seeped through the cracks. The darkness was almost absolute, broken only by distorted reddish reflections from the volcanic fury outside, casting ghostly shadows on the irregular walls, dancing figures from a nightmare. Lyra, exhausted and trembling, dragged herself inside, feeling the packed dirt floor beneath her feet. Her child, huddled in her arms, coughed incessantly, his face covered in ash and tears, a small body shivering with cold and fear. Others from her band and other groups had already found refuge there, their dark silhouettes barely discernible in the gloom, huddled in small knots of despair. Whispers and groans filled the air, mingling with the muffled sound of the convulsing outside world, a macabre melody of suffering. The smell of sulfur and ash was still perceptible, but less intense than outside, offering a small but significant relief, a temporary respite. Lyra found a relatively dry corner and huddled down, shielding her child from the cold and darkness, her body a shield against fear. With each breath, she felt the weight of the ash in her lungs, a sense of oppression that reminded her of the constant threat, an invisible, suffocating presence. The routine of survival resumed, adapted to the new, dark reality. The search for water was a priority, as the dry air and ash had caused an insatiable thirst. Lyra, in the darkness, groped the walls, finding small fissures where mountain water slowly trickled down, collecting the precious drops in a large leaf, each drop a treasure. Food was scarce, and the few roots and insects they had brought with them were divided sparingly among the group, a cruel reminder of the uncertainty that awaited them and the proximity of hunger. Children cried from hunger and fear, their small bodies trembling in the darkness, their cries faint and hopeless. Lyra could feel the tension growing among the survivors. Glances met in the gloom, charged with suspicion and despair. The instinct for self-preservation, once directed at escape, now turned against the group itself, eroding the bonds of community. Small fights broke out over a piece of food or a warmer, drier spot, civility unraveling under the pressure of scarcity. As Lyra watched, an elderly male, with bloodshot eyes and wrinkled skin, began to cough violently, his lungs expelling the accumulated volcanic dust, a hoarse, pain-filled cough. He staggered, and in a matter of seconds, fell to the cave floor, his body convulsing before lying still. No one moved to help him. Everyone's eyes, even the children's, were fixed on his body, not with sadness, but with the cold realization that it was one less competitor for limited resources. Lyra felt a shiver run down her spine, a chilling premonition. Death was no longer a sudden, violent event. It was a constant presence, a cold breath on her neck, lurking in every shadow, in every cough. She hugged her child tightly, feeling the warmth of his body as an anchor in the vastness of despair, the only thing keeping her sane. What would happen when hunger and thirst became unbearable? How much longer would their provisions last? And, most terrifying of all, what awaited them when and if the mountain's fury finally subsided and they emerged into the outside world. Would it still be the same world? Or would they have survived only to witness the death of everything they knew? An unrecognizable world where the promises of life had been burned to ash. The cave, once a refuge, began to become a slow tomb. Days, or what they perceived as days, merged into a single, unending night. Time had lost its meaning, governed only by the relentless advance of hunger and thirst. The air, though less dense with ash, was still heavy with the acrid smell of unwashed bodies, sweat, and the growing stench of despair. The mountain's roar outside had faded to a distant whisper, a constant murmur of the destruction that surrounded them, an omnipresent reminder of their fragility. But the internal threat, that of the group's survival, grew hour by hour, insidious and relentless. Lyra's eyes, accustomed to the gloom, could now discern the emaciated outlines of the other survivors. Their bodies, once strong and agile, were now skeletal, skin stretched taut over protruding bones, a painful sight of deprivation. The children, in particular, suffered most, their wails growing weaker but more frequent, an agonizing soundtrack that pierced Lyra's soul. Water, once a steady trickle, began to dry up, and every drop was fiercely contested. Murmurs turned into grumbles, and grumbles into heated arguments over who deserved the next portion. Lyra, with the little strength she had left, defended her child with a primal instinct, her eyes gleaming like embers in the darkness, her determination unyielding. She remembered a small underground lake she had discovered long ago, a secret place she used to hide in times of danger, a refuge that could now be salvation. It would be a perilous journey, traversing unknown tunnels and tight passages where the air could become thin and the darkness absolute. But it was their only chance to find enough water for them and perhaps for some others. She shared the idea with a few members of her band, those she still trusted, those who had children to protect and who still held a glimmer of hope. At first, there was hesitation. The fear of the unknown was as potent an enemy as hunger. But despair was a stronger motivator, pushing them beyond their limits. With the decision made, a small group, led by Lyra, began to venture into the depths of the cave. With small torches made of dry branches, all that their meager food provisions allowed to burn, casting ghostly shadows ahead. The air became denser and damper, and the smell of mold and rock intensified, mixed with the damp scent of stalactites and stalagmites. The cave walls were cold and moist to the touch, and the sound of their own footsteps echoed strangely, amplified by the darkness, creating a sense of isolation and vastness. Lyra could feel the gasping breaths of her companions with each stumble, each sigh, a reminder of the fragility of their lives, the precariousness of their existence. They found narrow passages that required them to crawl, tunnels that seemed endless, where claustrophobia threatened to engulf them. The fear of getting lost, of being swallowed by the earth itself, of never seeing daylight again, was a constant presence, a silent terror that accompanied them. At one point, the faint glow of their torches revealed a skeleton, that of a large animal trapped in a crevice, its bones white and clean, a chilling reminder of the death that awaited them if they failed. Lyra felt a shiver, but there was no time for reflection, only forward into the search. They continued with each turn, each bend, hope diminishing, fatigue increasing, their bodies reaching their limit. Lyra, with her child asleep in her arms, tried to remain calm, her senses sharpened, looking for any sign of water, any indication of salvation. Suddenly, a sound, a soft, constant drip, breaking the oppressive silence of the cave, like a promise from the very heart of the earth. Lyra raised her torch, and the light revealed ahead a dark pool of crystal-clear water. Emanating from the rocks, a perfect mirror of the darkness. A cry of relief escaped her lips, and the others, with their last ounces of strength, rushed to the water, drinking eagerly, their bodies absorbing the liquid life. But the journey did not end there. The cave had provided water, a temporary relief, but the uncertainty of the outside world persisted. How was the world out there? And what would they do when the water ran out again? Were they the last of their kind? The water gave them a breath of life, but the future remained a dark and unpredictable mist. Days, or what they perceived as days, dragged on in the cave, marked by quenched thirst and persistent hunger. The group had returned with the precious water, but food continued to be a challenge, a constant threat. The whispers of despair subsided, replaced by a heavy quiet, a kind of resignation, a silence laden with profound weariness. The mountain's roar outside had completely disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence, a vacuum of sound that was almost as disturbing as the previous fury, an emptiness that echoed the vastness of the destruction. Lyra, sensing a change in the air, a faint current, an intuition, decided it was time to try. It was an immense risk, but the alternative was a slow death in the darkness, a death without hope. With a small group, the strongest and most resilient, she crawled to the cave entrance, the torchlight trembling in her hands, a small point of light against the darkness of the unknown. The sight that awaited them was breathtaking and, at the same time, heartbreaking. The world outside had been transformed. The lush, vibrant forest was now a gray graveyard of charred trunks, ash, a post-apocalyptic landscape. The ground was covered by a thick layer of volcanic dust, which stretched as far as the eye could see, turning the landscape into a dead, gray sea, where the wind formed small, ephemeral dunes. The sky, once blue and vivid, was a pale shroud of ash, with a weak, ghostly sun barely penetrating the haze, a sickly light that tinged the world in melancholic hues. The air was cold and dry, and the smell of smoke and ash was still dominant, but there was a change. A faint, almost imperceptible, scent of life began to emerge, a whisper of a new beginning, of a rebirth. As they descended the mountainside, with each step, the ash rose and enveloped their feet, leaving ephemeral footprints on the surface of the dead earth. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the wind whispering through the skeletons of trees, a ghostly lament of those who perished. Lyra, with a heavy heart, looked at the vast expanse of destruction. Where once there had been life and abundance, now there was only death and desolation. Rivers had turned into streams of gray mud, ponds into stagnant pools, mirrors of hopelessness. The bodies of animals, some unrecognizable, others partially preserved by the ash, lay scattered across the landscape, silent witnesses to the earth's fury, reminding them of life's fragility. Lyra found a small green sprout, struggling to emerge from the layer of ash, a stubborn spark of life amid the devastation, a sign that hope was not completely lost. It was a glimpse of hope, tiny but present, a promise. The days that followed were a constant struggle for food and shelter. Lyra's group, now more cohesive by shared adversity, like a single resilient organism, scoured the landscape in search of anything that could sustain life. They found small pockets of potable water in craters formed by rain, and occasionally, roots and insects that had survived beneath the ash layer, small treasures in a world of scarcity. Hunting was almost impossible. Large herbivores had been annihilated or fled to distant lands, and the remaining predators were hungry and dangerous. Lyra and the others had to learn to adapt, to find new food sources, to rely on their intelligence and ingenuity, to unearth ancestral wisdom. They found a small lake that had been protected by the terrain's geography, and there, life began to resurface, with fish and frogs that became a vital source of food, a gift amidst the aridity. Months passed, and the sky began to slowly clear, revealing a pale blue behind the ash haze. The ash began to be washed away by the rain, and in some places, the bare earth began to appear, breathing again. Small green shoots, fragile but determined, began to pierce the gray mantle, a testament to life's resilience, its capacity to persist. The forest, though still in ruins, showed signs of a slow but certain rebirth, with new leaves appearing on charred branches. Animals that had fled began to return, cautiously, to the landscape that had once been their home, repopulating the desolate land. Lyra, watching her child play amidst the first blades of grass, his childish laughter echoing in the previously silent air, felt a renewed hope, a quiet certainty that life, somehow, always finds a way. The eruption had been a cataclysm, an event that almost erased them from the face of the earth, but it was also a catalyst, forcing them to evolve, to adapt, to discover new strengths and abilities that had been dormant within them. The story of their species, of Homo habilis, would continue, written not only in stone and bone, but in the resilience of an indomitable spirit, in the ability to rise from the ashes. The world had been remade, and they, the survivors, were ready to rebuild their lives, one day, one generation at a time. But the scars of the past, the forgotten secrets, and the future challenges still awaited to be unearthed. What else had time buried beneath the layers of ash? And what new stories, dark and thrilling, would emerge from this reborn land?